February 1889. By the ninth night of the deep freeze, Cold Hollow was dying of thirst. Every well in the county had failed. Iron pumps stood frozen solid, their handles locked in place as if welded there by an angry blacksmith. The creek behind the schoolhouse had turned into a ribbon of blue-white stone. Cattle bellowed through cracked lips in barns across the valley, and families gathered pots of snow that melted down to almost nothing when set upon the stove. Yet in the middle of that dying town, one barn glowed with a faint amber light every night as it had for more than a year. Most people had long since stopped paying it any mind. Nothing worth watching, they said. Only the old man again hauling his dirt. Thomas Ainsworth set down the small tin lantern he carried and hung it on a hook beside a shoring timber. He listened for a moment. Somewhere far below the barn floor, water moved. Not fast, not loud. Steady. The kind of sound a man hears in his chest before he hears it in his ears. Above him, the wind screamed across the frozen fields of Cold Hollow, Kansas. Behind him, on the straw-strewn barn floor, a black and tan hound named Pilot lay curled beside a stack of oak braces. The dog had not left his side for the better part of a year. Not once had Pilot barked at the neighbors who crept close to peek through the cracks. Not once had he growled at the boys who dared each other to knock on the barn door and run. Thomas picked up the pencil he kept tied to a rafter with a length of twine, turned to a page in a battered black notebook, and wrote a single line in blocky, engineer's script. Night 411. Water holding steady. Temperature at the working face, 49 degrees. While the town above him drank melted snow by the thimbleful, the shaft beneath his barn was doing exactly what he had calculated it would do. But why had he trusted a hole in the ground when every man in the county trusted the wells his grandfather had drilled? 15 months earlier, Cold Hollow had looked nothing like the frozen ruin the winter would eventually make of it. Thomas Ainsworth walked into the county clerk's office one warm September morning carrying a rolled bundle of survey papers under his arm. Behind the counter, Clerk Nathaniel Briggs looked up from a ledger, adjusted his spectacles, and offered the widower a careful nod. Everyone in town knew Thomas's story. Everyone had watched him bury a wife to fever 3 winters back, and everyone had watched him bury 2 grown sons the following spring after the Blackwater mine collapsed on the day shift. Nobody in the office expected him to file a claim. Thomas unrolled the papers on the counter. He tapped a knuckle against a small square drawn on his own property, directly beneath the barn he had built with his sons the year before the disaster. Briggs leaned forward and squinted. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. "You mean to dig a well?" Briggs asked. "Not a well," Thomas said quietly. "A shaft." The clerk set down his pen. 2 men waiting near the stove turned their heads. In a farming town like Cold Hollow, the word shaft belonged to mines and miners and to the funerals of miners. It did not belong beneath a man's own barn floor. Briggs looked at the drawing again, then at Thomas. "How deep?" he asked at last. Thomas met his eyes without blinking. "Deeper than the frost has ever gone." Word spread through Cold Hollow before Thomas even reached his wagon. By supper, half the town knew that the widower on the North Road had filed papers to dig some kind of mine under his own barn. By the following morning, the story had grown longer legs. Some said he was hunting for silver. Others swore he was looking for the bones of his boys, as though the Blackwater collapse had somehow tunneled all the way beneath his property. A few whispered that grief had finally cracked him open, the way a hard freeze cracks a stone. None of them were right, but none of them asked. Long before he ever set foot in Cold Hollow, Thomas Ainsworth had earned his living as a mine engineer for the Blackwater Company, 3 counties to the east. For 22 years he had planned shafts, calculated timber loads, and mapped drainage runs through some of the deepest coal seams in the state. His crews had trusted him because he trusted numbers. He kept notebooks the way other men kept Bibles. Every measurement, every observation, every quiet doubt found its way onto a page. He had raised his sons in the trade. Caleb, the older one, had inherited his father's slow, careful way of thinking. Silas, the younger, had inherited his mother's laugh and a talent for reading rock faces the way a preacher reads scripture. By the time both boys turned 20, they were shift foremen at Blackwater, and Thomas had begun to allow himself the small, dangerous luxury of pride. Then came the morning he had warned the company about for 6 months. A soft seam. A crosscut driven too far without proper bracing. A gallery that any engineer with eyes could see was carrying more weight than the timbers could hold. Thomas had written 3 memoranda. He had gone in person to the superintendent's office. He had been told, kindly and firmly, that the schedule did not permit further delay. He had been told to trust the plan. His boys had been on the day shift when the roof let go. After the funerals, Thomas walked away from Blackwater without collecting his final wages. He sold the house in the mining town. He bought 40 acres in Cold Hollow because the land was flat and empty and had never seen a pickaxe. He built a barn with his own hands, using the joinery his sons had learned from him. And for a full year afterward, he did nothing at all except sit on the porch and watch the wind move through the prairie grass. Then one afternoon, without saying a word to anyone, he took a shovel down to the barn and began to dig. The first person to notice was Mabel Whitcomb, a widow who lived on the neighboring property and who brought Thomas a jar of preserves once a month out of stubborn Christian duty. She arrived one evening in October to find lantern light glowing between the barn boards long after dark. She heard the steady, patient sound of a spade striking earth. She stood in the yard for several minutes, uncertain whether to knock. In the end, she left the jar on the step and walked home in silence. The next morning she told the postmaster. The postmaster told the blacksmith. The blacksmith told everyone who came into his shop. By the end of the week, half the town had heard that Thomas Ainsworth was digging a hole in his barn every night, and by the end of the month, the other half had come out to see it for themselves. They found the barn door bolted. They found the old man polite but silent. They found a wheelbarrow of fresh dirt beside the north wall, and a growing mound of dark earth spreading behind the barn like a scar. And they found, most troubling of all, that he would not tell a single soul what he was doing down there. The theories multiplied faster than the dirt piled up. At Corbin's General Store, a group of men gathered around the pot-bellied stove one November afternoon and worked the puzzle from every angle they could think of. Ezekiel Fry, who owned the largest cattle operation on the west side of the county, leaned back in his chair and declared that Thomas had gone treasure hunting. Old Spanish silver, he said, was buried all through the plains. His cousin in Missouri had heard stories. Reverend Josiah Lockridge, a lean man with a voice like a rasp on wet wood, offered a gentler explanation. Grief did strange things to a man, he said. Some drank, some prayed, some dug. It was not for the town to judge, only to pray. The blacksmith, Hollis Marsh, had a different theory altogether. He had once known a Welsh miner in Pennsylvania who had come home from a cave-in and spent the rest of his days building a scale model of the collapsed gallery in his cellar. Marsh believed Thomas was doing something similar, reconstructing the mine, he called it, trying to walk the boys back out of the rock, one shovel at a time. None of them were entirely wrong. None of them were right either. Meanwhile, the children of Cold Hollow developed their own private mythology. On dares, they crept up to the barn after dark and pressed their ears against the boards. They swore they heard whispering. They swore they heard singing. One boy, 10-year-old Ambrose Whitcomb, Mabel's grandson, claimed he had once heard the old man laughing softly to himself while he worked. Nobody believed him. Ambrose believed himself and told the story again to anyone who would listen. The daring escalated. A group of boys knocked on the door and ran. Another group tied a length of string to the latch and pulled it from behind the smokehouse. Thomas answered every disturbance the same way. He opened the door. He looked out at the empty yard. He closed the door and went back to work. Adults were not much better. When Thomas came into town for supplies, conversations went quiet. Men tapped their temples behind his back. Women pulled their children closer. At the counter of the general store, Corbin himself would ring up the flour and lamp oil and shoring nails and ask, in the careful voice of a man addressing an invalid, whether Thomas needed anything else today. Only 2 people in Cold Hollow treated him the way they always had. The first was Mabel Whitcomb. She continued to bring preserves. She did not ask about the barn. She spoke to him about the weather and about her grandson and about the price of laying hens, and Thomas answered her as though the world had not changed. Once, standing on his porch in the fatting light of a November evening, she looked past him toward the barn and said only, "Whatever you're doing down there, Thomas, I hope it gives you rest." He had not answered, but he had nodded, and she had taken that as enough. The second was Dr. Elias Renfrew, the town physician. Renfrew was a Boston-trained man in his late 50s who had come west after his own wife died and who understood better than most that grief could take shapes that looked like madness from the outside without being madness at all. He rode out to Thomas's farm one Sunday in December, sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee, and asked no questions about the barn. Instead, he asked about Caleb and Silas. Thomas talked for 2 hours, about Caleb's steadiness, about Silas's laugh, about the memoranda he had written and the answers he had received, about the morning of the collapse, about the funerals. When the doctor rose to leave, he laid a hand on Thomas's shoulder and said only, "Keep your notebooks. That's what will save you." Thomas did. The notebooks grew thicker as the seasons turned. By the first snowfall of that year, Thomas had filled 2 of them cover to cover and started a third. The pages held everything a mining engineer knew how to record: depth in feet and inches, composition of the soil at each stratum, angle of descent, timber dimensions and load calculations, moisture readings taken at 3 levels each morning, air temperature at the working face, the date and time of every observation. Nobody in Cold Hollow would have understood a single page of it. That was part of the reason Thomas kept working alone. The other reason was simpler. He did not trust himself yet, not fully. What he was attempting had been done in mining country in a dozen forms, but never here, never in this soil, never by a man with no crew and no company backing and no margin for a mistake. If he was wrong, the shaft would fail. If the shaft failed, he would lose a year of work, and more importantly, he would lose the reason he had begun. He had chosen the location beneath the barn for 4 specific reasons. The barn floor gave him cover from weather and from curious eyes. The subsoil beneath that particular corner of his property, based on the county's old survey maps, and on a set of soil borings he had taken himself the previous spring, appeared to sit above a limestone layer that ran east to west beneath the entire valley. Beneath that limestone, according to a geological report he had ordered from a professor at the State University, there was a strong likelihood of a confined aquifer fed by snowmelt from the low hills to the north. And the depth of that aquifer, if the report was accurate, would sit well below the deepest frost line ever recorded in the region. Everything he was doing came down to that last fact. The wells of Cold Hollow, including the one behind his own house, had been drilled to a depth of 30 to 40 feet. That depth was enough in a normal winter. Frost in the county rarely went below 3 or 4 feet. But Thomas had spent enough time reading weather records to know that normal was a word that fooled a man in the long run. He had seen the numbers from the winter of 1856. He had seen the numbers from 1873. He had seen frost lines punched down to 6 feet and lower in the harshest years. And he had seen wells fail because of it, entire counties reduced to melting snow for their livestock, while the animals dropped one by one. Thomas did not know when such a winter would come again. He only knew that when it did, a shaft driven deep enough to reach the aquifer beneath the limestone would still be running, while every pump in the county stood frozen solid. He worked at night for practical reasons as much as private ones. The barn stayed warmer with the doors closed. The lantern light did not attract idle visitors during working hours, and the physical labor gave him something to do with the long, dark evenings that had once belonged to his sons. The digging itself followed the discipline of any proper mine shaft. Thomas sank a vertical bore roughly 4 feet square, bracing every 3 feet of descent with oak timbers cut and squared in his own yard. He installed a simple hand-cranked windlass at the top, the way he had installed 100 of them in his career, and used it to raise the excavated soil in a wooden bucket. He hauled the dirt out through the rear barn door and spread it across a low patch of ground behind the smokehouse. Every measurement went into the notebook. Every timber received a number. Every night, before he climbed the ladder back to the surface, he ran his hand along the walls of the shaft and listened. He was listening for water. The water spoke to him for the first time on a warm night in late May, at a depth of 38 feet. Thomas had spent the previous week driving through a layer of dense clay that had slowed his progress to a crawl, and he had begun to worry that his calculations had been off, that the limestone shelf he was hunting sat deeper here than the professor's report had suggested. He had lowered himself into the shaft that evening more out of stubbornness than hope. He had picked up his mattock. He had swung it 3 times into the clay face. On the 4th swing, the tone of the strike changed. The metal rang instead of thudded. Thomas set down the mattock and pressed his palm against the wall. The clay was cold, colder than it had been an hour before. He picked up his lantern, held it close, and saw a faint darkening spreading through the clay like ink through paper. He had reached the top of the limestone. He climbed out that night without cutting another inch. He sat on an overturned crate in the barn with Pilot beside him and wrote 3 pages in his notebook by lantern light. Then he walked to the house, poured himself a small glass of the whiskey he almost never touched, and drank it slowly at the kitchen table while the sun came up over the fields. Cutting through limestone was a different kind of work. It required a different set of tools. Thomas made a trip into the county seat that summer and returned with steel wedges, a pair of hand drills, and a small quantity of blasting powder that he stored in a locked box in the smokehouse. He had used powder 1,000 times in his career. He respected it the way a good shepherd respects a wolf. He would use it only when he had no other choice. For most of the summer, he cut the limestone by hand. He drilled a series of holes in a careful pattern, drove wedges into them with a heavy mallet, and let the pressure of the wedges split the stone along its natural planes. It was slow work. Some nights he removed less than a foot of material. He kept at it anyway, because slow work done right was faster in the end than fast work done wrong. His sons had learned that from him. He had learned it from his own father, who had spent 40 years underground. By the end of August, he was through the limestone. The bottom of the shaft now sat at 51 feet below the barn floor, and the walls of the last 3 feet consisted of a lighter, more porous rock that Thomas recognized immediately from the professor's report. He was inside the aquifer layer. Water had begun to seep steadily into the base of the shaft, filling the bucket to a depth of 6 inches every night. He installed a small hand pump at the surface and drew a sample. The water was clear. It tasted clean and faintly mineral, the way good spring water tastes. He carried a jar of it to Dr. Renfrew the following week without saying where it had come from and asked the doctor to examine it. Renfrew held the jar to the light, uncorked it, sniffed it, tasted it, and looked at Thomas over his spectacles. "Whatever spring you found," he said, "is a good one." Thomas nodded. He did not explain. He had not yet finished. A functional well was one thing. What Thomas wanted was better. He wanted a shaft that could deliver water reliably in any conditions, including a winter that drove frost deeper than any winter in living memory. That meant lining the upper portion of the shaft with additional insulation, installing a covered wellhead that could be operated from inside a heated space, and running the pump line down through a channel packed with straw and sawdust. The work took him through the autumn. Autumn in Cold Hollow that year came in cold and stayed cold. The first frost arrived in early October, 3 weeks earlier than the almanac had predicted. By the end of the month, the leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek had gone from gold to brown to gone in what felt like a single week of hard wind. Farmers who had planned to finish their corn harvest in leisurely fashion found themselves working from dawn to dark to beat the freeze. Cattle were brought in from the far pastures earlier than usual. Woodpiles grew. Thomas noticed all of it. He also noticed things that other men did not. He noticed that the geese had gone south nearly a full month ahead of their usual schedule. He noticed that the muskrats in the creek behind his property had built their lodges higher up the bank and thicker in the walls than he had ever seen them build before. He noticed that Pilot, who had always slept on the porch by choice regardless of the weather, had begun scratching at the kitchen door well before sundown, asking to be let in for the night. He noticed that the barometer he kept mounted on the wall of his back room had been trending downward in a slow, patient curve for the better part of 3 weeks. None of these signs by themselves meant anything. Taken together, they meant something Thomas had seen once before, in the winter of 1873, when he had been a young engineer in the eastern coal country, and the frost had gone so deep that men had chopped through 6 feet of frozen earth to reach a buried water line. He finished the insulation work on the shaft in the second week of November. He installed the covered wellhead. He ran the pump line down through its packed channel. He tested the pump on the coldest night of the month and drew up a full bucket of clear water in under a minute. Then he sat down in the barn and wrote a single line in his notebook. "The shaft is ready. The winter is not." He rode into town the following morning. He tied his wagon in front of the general store, walked inside, and stood by the stove for a long moment before speaking. Corbin looked up from his ledger. 2 farmers by the counter turned their heads. Thomas took off his hat and said quietly but clearly that he believed a hard freeze was coming, harder than any of them had seen. He suggested that families check the depth of their wells. He suggested that stock tanks be filled while the pumps still worked. He suggested that every household lay in extra firewood and hay for the animals. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Ezekiel Fry, standing by the counter with a sack of coffee on his shoulder, laughed out loud. "The mole from the barn is now a weatherman," he said. The 2 other farmers chuckled. Corbin did not laugh, but he did not defend Thomas either. He simply looked down at his ledger and pretended to add a column of numbers. Thomas put his hat back on his head. He walked out of the store. He climbed onto his wagon and drove home. He did not make a second trip. Only Dr. Renfrew and Mabel Whitcomb took the warning seriously. Renfrew ordered an extra half-quart of firewood and filled every pot and basin in his house with water. Mabel filled her stock tank to the brim and had her grandson Ambrose carry buckets from the creek to top off her cistern until the ice grew too thick to break. She did these things without explaining herself to her neighbors. She had known Thomas long enough to trust him whether the rest of the town did or not. The first heavy snow fell 3 days later. The temperature that night dropped to 18 below zero and did not climb above zero for the rest of the week. The Great Freeze had begun. By the 3rd day of the freeze, Cold Hollow began to understand that this was not an ordinary winter. The pump at the schoolhouse locked up first. Teacher Miss Henrietta Doyle sent the children home at noon because there was no water for the drinking bucket and no way to boil coffee for the stove. That evening, the pump at the livery stable failed. By the 4th morning, half the wells on the south side of town had gone silent, their handles rising and falling on nothing but frozen air. Men at first assumed the failures were mechanical. They poured hot water over the pump heads. They wrapped them in burlap. They built small fires beside the well caps. Nothing worked. The trouble was not in the pumps. The trouble was in the ground. The frost had driven down past every water level in the county. On the 6th day, the first cattle began to die. Ezekiel Fry lost 4 head before he understood what was happening. His hands had been hauling water from the creek in the mornings, but the creek was frozen to the bed by then, and the ice had to be cut with axes and melted in barrels over a fire. The process yielded a fraction of what a herd of 200 needed to drink. Fry ordered his men to melt snow in every kettle they could find. It was not enough. Cattle drink far more water than most townspeople realize. A cow in winter needs 10 gallons a day at minimum. 100 head need 1,000 gallons. Snow, when melted, gives up only 1/10 of its volume in water. The math defeated him within a week. Other ranchers began losing stock. Horses stood in their stalls with their heads lowered, refusing feed because they had no water to wash it down. Milk cows dried up. Pigs squealed through the nights. A dozen families brought their animals into the kitchens of their own houses to keep them from freezing while they figured out how to keep them alive. In the town itself, the situation grew worse by the day. Water for cooking and drinking had to be rationed. Miss Doyle closed the school entirely. Reverend Lockridge held services in the parsonage instead of the church because there was no water to thaw the frozen doors of the sanctuary. Dr. Renfrew rode from house to house with a bag of medicines and a smaller bag of hard truths, telling families to conserve, telling them to keep their animals close, telling them that a thaw would come but that he did not know when. On the 8th day, Ambrose Whitcomb rode his pony out to his grandmother's farm with a message from his mother in town. As he passed the Ainsworth place, he slowed. The Ainsworth barn was quiet, but a thin curl of smoke rose from a small chimney Thomas had installed at the peak of the roof, something Ambrose had never noticed before. And in the pasture beside the barn, Thomas's small herd of 8 cattle stood in the sun, chewing cud, their coats thick and their sides round. They looked, Ambrose would say later, like cattle in a picture book, not like cattle in a dying town. He rode on to his grandmother's farm and told her what he had seen. Mabel Whitcomb listened, set down her knitting, and said only then he did it. Did what? Ambrose asked. Whatever he was doing all those nights, she said. Ambrose was young, but he was not slow. He rode back into town that afternoon and told his mother. His mother told the neighbor. The neighbor told the blacksmith. By suppertime, the story had reached Corbin's general store, where a small group of men stood warming themselves by the stove and trying not to think about their livestock. Ezekiel Fry heard the story last. He set down his coffee cup and stared at the wall for a long moment. Then he reached for his coat. Fry rode out to the Ainsworth farm the next morning with 3 other men behind him. The temperature had climbed to 12 below zero by 10 o'clock, which passed for warmth that week. Their horses' breath rose in white plumes as they came up the long, rutted lane past the smokehouse. Thomas was already outside, forking hay from a covered rick into a trough for his cattle. Pilot stood beside him, watching the riders approach without a sound. Fry reined in 10 feet from the trough. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the trough. Then he looked at what was in the trough, which was not only hay but a shallow layer of water, clear and unfrozen, steaming faintly in the cold. He climbed down from his horse without speaking. Thomas set the fork against the rick and waited. Fry was not a small man, and he was not a soft one, and he had spent the better part of a year making jokes at Thomas's expense. He stood now in front of the widower he had called the mole from the barn and could not for a long moment find any words at all. Finally he took off his hat. "Thomas," he said, "my herd is dying." Thomas nodded once. "I know it," he said. Fry looked at the trough again. He looked at Thomas. He did not ask the question. He did not have to. Thomas turned toward the barn and beckoned with one gloved hand. Fry and the 3 men followed him. Pilot came behind, tail low, calm as a churchyard cat. Inside the barn, Thomas walked to a broad wooden platform in the north corner and pulled back a hinged trapdoor. Beneath it, a square shaft descended into the earth, its walls braced with squared oak timbers set at precise intervals, its edges dressed with the neat, patient craftsmanship of a man who had built such things for a living. A ladder ran down one wall. A hand pump stood beside the opening, its intake pipe wrapped in straw and canvas and disappearing into the shaft below. A small cast iron stove sat against the interior wall of the platform, radiating gentle heat into the space around the wellhead. Fry stared down into the shaft for a long time. "How deep?" he said at last. 51 feet, Thomas said, "through clay and through the limestone, into the aquifer beneath." Fry looked at him. "And the water comes up warm," Thomas said. 49 degrees at the working face. "I hit a spring when I broke through the limestone. It runs steady. It has run steady for 6 months. One of the other men, a rancher named Willem Croft who had lost 11 head in the past week, sat down slowly on an overturned crate and put his face in his hands. He did not weep. He simply held his face for a long moment, and then he looked up at Thomas and said, "We called you crazy." Thomas did not answer that. He walked to the stove, took a coffee pot from its top, and poured 4 tin cups of coffee for the men who had ridden out to see the mole from the barn. He handed them out one at a time. Then he sat down on a bench beside the shaft and told them, quietly and without heat, what he intended to do. He intended to run a pipe from the wellhead out to the road. He intended to build a communal trough at the front of his property, sheltered by a small 3-sided shed with a stove of its own, so the water would not freeze between the pump and the trough. He intended for every family in Cold Hollow to bring their livestock to that trough for as long as the freeze lasted. He intended to charge nothing. Fry set down his cup. "What do you need from us?" he said. The pipe went in that afternoon. Fry rode back to town and returned within 2 hours with 8 men, a wagon load of lumber, 3 coils of iron pipe scavenged from the livery and the smithy, and every roll of tar paper Corbin had in his store. Dr. Renfrew came out with a jug of hot coffee and a bag of tools. Holly's Marsh brought his forge on a sled behind 2 draft horses and set it up in the yard so he could work the pipe joints on site. Reverend Lockridge, who had never held a hammer in earnest in his life, brought a shovel and asked what he could do to help. Thomas directed the work the way he had once directed shift crews at Blackwater. He was calm. He was precise. He treated every man on the site as though the man had shown up out of respect rather than out of desperation, which cost him nothing and gave the work a dignity it might otherwise have lacked. He set 2 men to trenching a shallow channel from the barn to the road. He set 2 more to cutting and framing the 3-sided shed. He set Marsh to threading and joining the pipe. He set Renfrew to insulating the pipe run with straw and burlap. He set Reverend Lockridge to feeding the small stove that would sit inside the trough shed and to watching the temperature of the water as it came out of the pump. By sundown, water was flowing. The trough itself was a simple thing, a long wooden box lined with tin and set on a bed of packed straw. A pipe rose from the ground at one end and delivered a steady, quiet stream of clear water into the box. The shed around it kept the wind off. The small stove inside the shed, fed by scraps of oak, kept the air just warm enough that the water would not freeze between fillings. A gate at the front of the shed opened onto the road so that animals could walk in, drink, and walk out again. The first cattle to drink from it were Ezekiel Fry's. He drove 12 head down the road from his ranch that evening, and every one of them lowered its head to the trough and drank until Fry had to push them away to give the next group its turn. By the next morning, the road past the Ainsworth barn was busy from sunrise to sunset. Ranchers drove their herds down in shifts arranged by Fry himself, who had appointed himself the unofficial keeper of the schedule. Farmers with a single milk cow or a pair of horses walked their animals over in the afternoon. Families came in wagons with barrels to fill for household use. Thomas asked nothing of any of them except that they treat the trough and the shed with care, refill the stove when they used it, and let the next family through. He watched them come and go from the door of his barn, and he wrote every visit in his notebook, not the names, only the numbers, head of cattle watered, gallons drawn, barometer reading, temperature at the wellhead. On the 3rd day of the operation, Mabel Whitcomb walked down to the trough carrying a covered basket. She did not have livestock to water. She had brought bread. She set the basket on the bench inside the shed and walked up to the barn and knocked on the door. When Thomas opened it, she looked at him for a long moment. "Your boys," she said, "would be proud of you." Thomas did not answer at first. He looked past her at the road, at the small line of wagons waiting their turn at the trough, at the smoke rising from the shed and from his barn and from the low, gray sky above the pasture. Then he looked back at Mabel and nodded once. "That," he said quietly, "is what I was hopping for." The freeze broke on the 18th day. A soft wind came up from the south one afternoon, and the temperature climbed above 0 for the first time in nearly 3 weeks, and within a week, the creek behind the schoolhouse had begun to run again in a thin, halting trickle. Wells stayed frozen for another month, but families who had lost no more than a few animals now understood how close they had come to losing everything. Cold Hollow, when it counted its living and its dead, found that not a single family had lost its entire herd. Not a single household had gone without drinking water. Not a single child had gone thirsty. The trough at the front of the Ainsworth property had run without pause the entire time. When the town council met in March to discuss what had happened, Ezekiel Fry stood up before the vote and made a short speech that Dr. Renfrew would later say was the only useful speech Fry ever gave in his life. Fry proposed that the town raise a purse to pay Thomas Ainsworth for the water his shaft had provided. He proposed a figure that would have bought Thomas a new barn and a new team of horses and left him enough to live comfortably for a decade. The motion carried unanimously. A delegation rode out to the Ainsworth farm the following morning to deliver the news. Fry led it. Reverend Lockridge came. Corbin came. Dr. Renfrew came. Mabel Whitcomb came because Ambrose insisted on riding along and she would not let him ride alone. Thomas listened to the offer without interrupting. When Fry had finished, Thomas took off his hat and turned it slowly in his hands for a long moment. "I cannot take the money," he said at last. Fry started to protest. Thomas raised a hand and stopped him. "I will ask one thing of you," he said. "If you would grant it, I would consider the account more than settled." "Anything," Fry said. Thomas led them to the barn. He stood beneath the wide double door at the front and looked up at the heavy oak beam that ran across the top of it. He put his hand against the wood. "I would like 2 names carved here," he said, "above the door. Deep enough that weather will not take them out in my lifetime, or in yours, or in your grandson's. I want every animal that drinks at the trough and every man and woman who comes to fill a barrel to walk past those names on their way in and on their way out." He paused. "Caleb," he said, "and Selah's." Nobody spoke. "They were my boys," Thomas said. "They were engineers like me. They died because a company would not listen to a warning that would have saved them. I could not dig safe for them then. I could dig safe here. If this water runs past their names for the rest of my life, and past their names for the rest of yours, then they will have saved this town in a way I could not save them. That is enough. That is all I want." Holly's Marsh carved the names himself the following week. He worked slowly and carefully, the way a man works when he understands that he is making something that will outlast him. When he finished, the letters stood 2 inches deep in the oak, and the sunlight caught them cleanly in the mornings and in the evenings. Thomas lived another 11 years in the house beside the barn. Pilate lived 7 of them and was buried beneath the cottonwoods at the edge of the pasture. Mabel Whitcomb visited every week until her own death, 3 years before Thomas. Ambrose Whitcomb grew up, became a mining engineer himself, and carried his grandfather's copy of Thomas's notebooks with him for the rest of his career. The trough at the front of the Ainsworth property ran until 1934. The names above the barn door are still there.